The first strategy is called expansion strategy, which is growth oriented. You would like to increase the size of your firm. So merger and acquisition, tender offers, asset acquisition of some other company, or getting into a joint venture with some company is an option of expansion. Opposite of expansion is contraction. So in contraction, you have choice of spin-off, split off, divestitures, equity carved out, and split up. So this is the second possibility. The third possibility is to change or increase the corporate control. So anti-takeover defenses, share repurchases, exchange offers, and proxy contests are part of corporate control. And finally, the last choice that you have is changing or changes in the ownership structure. So you have options of leverage buyout, MLP, going private, and ESOP. So now onwards, we're going to discuss each of the strategy and the possibility or the transactions in detail. So let's start with the first one, the more simpler one, which is called an expansion. So the expansion strategy is followed when organization aims at high growth by substantially broadening the scope of its business. So either you are trying to increase the scope of the business by increasing the size, or you are acquiring somebody, you are diversifying. So broadly, you are trying to increase the scope of the business. So either you are growing in terms of the same industry, or you are growing probably by acquiring a new industry firm. So it could be an organic growth, or it could be a diversification. But ultimately, you would like to grow. A very simple transaction for expansion is called merger. So merger is a transaction where two firms agree to integrate their operations on a relatively co-equal basis is called merger. So obviously you have two different entities, they combine together, right? So it's called a fusion of two or more companies through a direct acquisition of the net asset of the others. So merger is basically when two entities merge together, right? It results when the shareholder of more than one company, usually two, decide to pool the resources of the company under a common equity. So there is company A shareholders and there is company B shareholders, and they agree to pool their resources together in a new entity called AB. Accordingly, in a merger, two or more companies combine into a single unit and lose their individual entities. So mergers could be of two types. If A and B are merging, there is one possibility that B loses its entity and becomes A. That's number one. It is also possible that both A and B loses their individual entity and they become C, right? So either there is one company who's surviving and the other company loses the entity, separate legal entity, or both of them loses the separate legal entity and there's a new company formed out of it. Acquisition. So acquisition may be defined as an act of acquiring effective control by one company over the assets and management of the other company without any combination. So the main difference between merger and acquisition is in merger, they combine their operations or pool of resources. In acquisitions, they don't combine. One company effectively takes a control of the other company, but both the entities remain independent, separate legal entity. But there may be change in the control of the company. So let's say there are two companies, A or B. A and B, if both of them merge, then they become one company. That is called merger. If A acquires B, then A and B still remains separate legal entity. However, the control of B shifts to A, right? So in an acquisition, there is a exchange of a control or there is a shift of the control. Takeover. A takeover may be defined as obtaining control over management of the company by another company. An acquisition or takeover does not necessarily entail full legal control. A company can have effective control over the other company by holding a minority ownership also. So you don't need to actually go up to 51%. you can actually control the company even if you have less than 50% ownership. If you are the largest shareholder, you can still control the company without owning it completely or majority cases. Even 51% is also not required. If you are, let's say, having 26% of the ownership, but you are the largest shareholder, so because of your voting right, you may have an effective control over the other company. You don't need to actually go up to 51%. Now, acquisition and takeover may sound similar, but generally there is a difference, and the slight difference is explained. In general, acquisition describes a amicable transaction, right? So amicable transaction means generally both the companies are agreeing. The target is also agreeing and the acquirer is also agreeing, where both firms cooperate. Whereas takeover generally suggests that target company is resisting or strongly opposes the purchase. The term merger is used when purchasing and target companies mutually combine. So in merger and acquisition, there is a consent of the target company to be acquired or to be merged. Whereas in takeover, generally, it is not the choice. They resist the takeover, but it is done through a process called hostile takeover. So you have mergers, you have acquisitions, and you have takeovers. Now, what are two main types of takeovers? So two main types of takeovers are generally friendly and hostile. So management of companies, generally when they have agreement in terms of combination, and it is also recommended and approved by shareholders, it could be a friendly takeover. This will lead to a single transaction involving assets or voting of shares. And takeover could be hostile also. So in hostile takeover, basically, management of companies involved are unable to agree on the terms of combination. And the management of one of the company makes a tender offer directly to the shareholders of the other company to tender their shares for the security or the assets of the acquiring company. So let's just try and understand with an example. Let's say company A wants to acquire company B. So company A wants to acquire company B. The session is going on? Yes, sir. Company A wants to acquire company B. Now there is one possibility that company A approaches company B and ask for a friendly takeover. So if they agree and terms are okay, it will become a friendly takeover. But if it is not possible, there is some problem in terms of understanding, then what company A will do is they will not approach company B. Instead, they will directly approach company, let's say, B's shareholders. And they ask to submit or tender the shares, right? So in case of, is the slide visible?
No, sir.
Okay, I'll just try. Now it's visible? I hope now it's visible.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I'll just try and explain what I was trying to explain. In a friendly thing, both the companies are agreeing and there is a mutually accepted transaction. In case of hostile takeover, there is disagreement, but still an acquirer wants to acquire the other company, so he will approach directly to the shareholders of company B. So instead of approaching the company, they approach the shareholders directly in the open market and they request to tender their shares to company A. So in this case, company A is actually forcefully trying to acquire company B by buying out the shares from the open market. So company B does not want to get taken over, but company A is trying to do it by open market. So in friendly and hostile takeover, the main difference is the consent. In friendly takeover, both the companies are agreeing, the acquirer is also agreeing, and the target is also agreeing. Whereas in case of hostile takeover, the target is not agreeing, but the acquirer anyways want to acquire the company, so it he or she, maybe the company, goes into open market and buys the share from the open market from the shareholders of the target company by giving them a tender offer, right? So generally hostile takeovers are very aggressive. They are very expensive also because that does not involve a consent. So there are a lot of complications involved. So mostly majority of the mergers or takeovers are of a friendly nature. Very few cases you may have something called an hostile takeover, right? So friendly versus hostile. Now, what could be the forms of business combination? So when you talk about combination, probably merger or acquisition, there are three possibilities could be cited. One is called a statutory merger. So in a statutory merger, one company merges with the other company and one of them cease to exist. Actually, the accounting term or the Indian notion for merger is called amalgamation. So in amalgamation, which is called a statutory merger, there are two companies, let's say company AA and company BB. Company AA and company BB merges, but company BB loses its separate legal entity and it is now only one entity, which is called AA company. So this is a statutory merger. In second case, you have something called a statutory consolidation. So in a statutory consolidation, there are two companies, AA and BB. Both of them lose their legal entity, separate legal entity, and by merger, they become a new company called double C. So in merger, one of the company may survive and other company will lose its separate legal entity. In case of consolidation, both the companies will lose their separate legal entity and a new company is formed. Third could be stock acquisition. So in case of stock acquisition, both the companies will remain separate legal entities. However, AA company will acquire a controlling stake in BB company. So both of them will remain separate legal entity. However, the change of control will be there. So AA may have a controlling stake in BB. So they will be able to influence the decision making. So either you lose your entity, either both of them loses the entity or both of them retains the entity, but the control or the ownership changes. So these are the three possibilities in case of combinations. Now let's understand what is a statutory merger. So a statutory merger is a combination of two or more firms in which all but one cease to exist. Legally, the combined organization continues under the original name of surviving firm. So in a statutory merger, one of the entities, like in this case, BB company ceased to exist and AA company is surviving. So the new company will be under the surviving company's name, which is AA, right? The operations of previously separate companies are carried on a single legal entity. In a typical merger, shareholders of a target firm, after voting to approve the merger, exchange their shares to those with the acquiring firm. So in the case, the shareholders of BB will exchange their share with the AA, right? So now they will become the shareholders of a acquiring firm. Those not voting in favor, like minority shareholders who would not like to be part of it, are required to accept the merger and exchange their shares for those to the acquirer. So ultimately, the entity ceased to exist and it is merged with the new entity under the surviving entity's name. So that is the nomenclature or the process or the structure of a statutory merger. Next is statutory consolidation. In a statutory consolidation, all entities that are consolidated are dissolved during the formation of new company, which usually has a new name. So if we go back, I'm talking about scenario number B, where two entities were there, AA and BB. In the process of merger, both of them will be dissolved and they will lose their separate entity and they both will be combined and a new company will be created with the new name. So that's a statutory consolidation. So in a statutory consolidation, the assets and liabilities of combining companies are transferred to a newly created corporation. There was an corporate example that in 1999, Daimler-Benz and Chrysler, both of them merged together, both of them dissolved their separate entities, and there was a new company formed, Daimler Chrysler, in 1999. So that was an example of a statutory consolidation. The third case is stock acquisition. This is very simple and self-explanatory. One company acquires the voting share of the other company, and two companies continue to operate as separate but related legal entities. So in this case, this is the scenario number C, or the third scenario, where both the companies are separate legal entity. Company A acquires the controlling stake and voting power in company B. So both of them after acquisition also remain separate legal entity, but the controlling stake of B shifts to A, right? So this is an easier way to actually go for a company rather than going for a merger and acquisition, because it involves legal process, whereas stock acquisition is relatively easy and straightforward. So this is basically a parent subsidiary relationship. For general purpose of financial reporting, a parent company and its subsidiaries present consolidated financial statement that appear largely as if the companies had actually merged into one. So when you do the stock acquisition in a consolidated balance sheet, so there is something called a standalone balance sheet and there is something called a consolidated balance sheet. So I'll just try and explain you with the help of an example. Let's say company A is a parent company and company B is a subsidiary where company A owns company B. So in a standalone balance sheet of company A or in a standalone financial statements of company A, all the details related to company A will be presented. But when you prepare a consolidated balance sheet, company A's balance sheet will be merged with company B's balance sheet. So that is called a consolidated balance sheet. So consolidated balance sheet includes parent plus all subsidiaries owned by that. That is called a consolidated balance sheet. And a standalone balance sheet is the balance sheet of the parent company only. So in a standalone balance sheet, you may assess the performance of only the parent, whereas in case of a consolidated one, you may have to consider the parent company as well as their subsidiaries. Expansion, tender offer, and asset acquisition. So two more strategies for expansion is, one is called tender offer and third is called asset acquisition. What is a tender offer? When the two companies, the target and the acquirer, they try negotiation, but negotiation fails. So there is no agreement. So friendly merger or friendly takeover is not possible. So in that case, what company can do is the acquirer may offer the company, target company's shareholder, a tender offer where they are requested to tender their share to the acquirer, right, at a price which is slightly higher than the market price. So company A automatically develops or gets the controlling stake of company B. Once they get substantial control stake, they can take over the company. They generally fire the existing management. In a hostile takeover, it's very common. The moment the acquirer acquires the company, the first thing that they do is they fire the existing management, which was in the disagreement with the acquisition or a merger transaction, right? So in case of a tender offer, a public offer is made for acquiring the shares of the target company. Here, the acquisition of the shares of target company indicates the acquisition of management control of that particular company. So this is an indirect way of controlling a company without involving the management of the target company. For instance, India Cements gave an open offer to the shareholders of Rashi Cement. So they must have gone for a negotiation, but it did not work out. So India Cement actually gave an open offer to the shareholders of Rasi Cement to tender their shares. The next is asset acquisition. So this is a slightly different perspective. Instead of acquiring an entire company, you are just interested in acquiring a particular business part or vertical of that company, or you are just interested in acquiring certain assets of that target company. So in this case, you are not acquiring the entire company, you are just acquiring a portion of their business or portion of their assets. So asset acquisitions imply buying the assets of the other company. Such assets may be intangible assets like a manufacturing unit of a firm, or an intangible asset like brand, trademark, etc. In case of asset acquisition, the acquirer company may limit its acquisition to those parts of the firm which matches the need of the acquirer company. So in an asset acquisition, you're just trying to purchase a portion of the target's business. You are not interested in the entire operation of target, but you would like to buy a portion of target's asset. For example, Lafarge of France acquired a cement division of Tata Group and restricted only up to 1.70 million ton cement plant and the assets relating to such divisions of Tata Group. So when Lafarge, they actually acquired a cement division, they did not acquire the entire thing. They only limit themselves to the plant with the capacity of 1.70 million and the assets related to that. So in this case, they are not acquiring the entire company, they're not acquiring the entire business, but they are acquiring the portion of the asset which could be matching their requirement. So asset acquisitions are generally very easy because you don't have to actually go and acquire the entire company. It becomes effective also because it may happen that a company has 4 or 5 divisions, out of which one division only is your interest. So just for that one division, you will not end up buying the entire company. You will just buy that particular division which matches your strategic needs and which is in alignment of your strategy. Now the next is joint venture. Joint venture is very simple. When two companies consolidate for a temporary partnership, that is also called consortium, for a specified purpose. Joint ventures may be useful to gain the access of new business, mainly under 4 conditions. Now, what are some of the reasons why people go for joint venture? No, actually, there is nothing in tender offer. It's a legal offer and you are sending it through market, so it's not illegal. You're not buying something from an illegal market. You're just trying to buy from the legal market by giving them an offer. So you are giving them a choice to purchase. There is no force. It is entirely legal, right? And it is done. So there is nothing wrong with it. Yeah. So joint ventures, under what circumstances? Under what circumstances you can go for a joint venture? So number one, when activity is uneconomical for an organization to do alone. I'll just give you an example. In airline industry, there are a lot of joint ventures. For example, Vistara Airline. So it's a Tata and Singapore Airlines joint venture. Now, when joint ventures are most fruitful, when a company cannot take that activity by themselves. It is too large and it involves huge amount of funds and it involves huge amount of risk also. So in that case, joint venture is a better option. Then the risk of business has to be shared and therefore reduced to the participation form. When a project is very huge, if it involves huge amount of investment and it is very risky, it is not advisable to take it alone. It's better to keep other people involved. So the risk is also shared. So that is also one of the reasons of joint venture. Third, when the distinctive competence of 2 or more organizations can be brought together. So when both the companies have distinct capabilities and they can complement each other, then it's better that both of them do a joint venture thing. And fourth, when setting up an organization requires surmounting hurdles such as import quotas, tariff, nationalistic political interest, and cultural roadblocks. See, I'll give you an example. Mostly consortium is actually used for lending to developing countries. So let's say somebody is lending to, let's say, Ethiopia, and they would like to do a power plant. So whatever example I'm actually sharing is a real example that in Ethiopia, they wanted to set up a power plant. Now, Ethiopia had a history of a civil war. So it was very risky for a single lender or a single investor to go and invest. So they create a consortium of people where International Finance Corporation, Export-Import Banks of US and UK, and the other entities came together and they funded that project. So in joint venture case, when you are trying to get into a developmental or developing financing, it becomes very risky. When there are nationalist or political interest involved, it's better to involve other people, because whenever you are putting any project in a developing country, it is always advisable to take the government of that country as a partner. Otherwise, what will happen is something called an expropriation. What is expropriation? Expropriation when the host government forcefully acquires your asset. So I'll just give you an example of an expropriation. So let's say you invest in a developing country like Ethiopia or maybe some sub-Saharan African countries. So you get into that country, you convince the government that you would like to set up a power plant. So government initially agrees. You do it, you construct the plant, and suddenly the government passes the resolution that whatever factories are on the soil of our country belongs to us. So what is happening? The asset was actually created by you. Asset belonged to you, but ultimately government passed the resolution and they forcefully acquire your asset. That is called an expropriation. So whenever you are venturing into any uncharted territory or new terrains, it's better to keep a joint venture kind of a system where you involve parties who are local to it. So whenever a new foreign entity is entering into India, they always opt for a joint venture, an Indian partner option. And this is very common in insurance industry. In insurance industry, there are a lot of joint ventures. So one of the example is Bharti AXA General Insurance Company Limited is an actual joint venture between India's Bharti Enterprises and insurance major from France, AXA. So in insurance, there are a lot of joint ventures. In airline, there are a lot of joint ventures. So joint venture is also one way of expansion. So let's just review it. What could be the forms of expansion? So forms of expansion could be mergers, right? So we discuss mergers, then acquisition and takeover, right? So takeover could be friendly or hostile. Then statutory merger or consolidation, that's a structure. Stock acquisition, tender offer, and asset acquisition. So that actually ends the story of expansion. Now let's move to the next. And joint venture also, yeah, that's also part of expansion. So now let's move to the next, which is called contraction. Right. So before we move to contraction, I still would like to understand the logic. Why do companies go for contraction? Can you give me a reason of contraction? Why a big company would like to cut itself in a small size? Consolidation is basically when both the entities lose their separate legal entity and a new company is formed. In joint venture, it is just like a partnership. Both the entities retain their separate legal entity. So it's joint venture is kind of a deal where consolidation is kind of a rebirth. Okay, excess capacity in use. Okay, reduce the risk to reduce the losses. What is the problem when your organization is very big and it has a lot of subsidiaries? Can you answer that question? See, when your organization is big, one problem is managing a big organization becomes a problem. Second, if you have, let's say, 4 subsidiaries, one subsidiary has a very high growth potential, right? But you have to manage all 4 subsidiaries. So neither you are giving the focus that it requires, nor you are giving the freedom that it requires. So it's better to keep that entity separate and allow it to grow. Third possibility could be that you have 4 subsidiaries, out of which one subsidiary is making losses. It is actually affecting your corporate balance sheet. So instead of keeping that subsidiary with you, you would like to get rid of it, right? So consolidation के बाद contraction के case में क्या होता है that you have lot of businesses and you are not able to manage it. You're too big to manage. So in order to improve the efficiency, in order to make them independent, in order to make them accountable, and in order to make them more efficient, you may try and cut the businesses into different size and probably make them either independent or sell it to somebody or change the structure. That process is called contraction. Sometimes for managing debts also. So Akshay is correct. Sometimes when you want to manage huge debt, probably as a parent or corporate level. So I'll just try and give you an example that as a parent or a corporate, you would not like to finance yourself with debt, but you would like to finance one of the subsidiaries through debt. So that could be also one of the reason that you would like to go for a contraction. That case was actually restructured. It was a financial restructuring. It was not a contraction. So it was a financial restructuring where they try and reduce the size of the debt phenomenally high, right? Contraction, one of the principal factor is operational efficiency. Very rare case it is done with the intention of financial benefits. Okay, so let's now move on to the contraction. What is contraction? So contraction is a second form of restructuring. In case of contraction, generally the size of firm gets reduced. So it is opposite to expansion. Now, contraction may take form of a spin-off, a split-off, a divestitures, a split-ups, and a equity carve-out. So let's just try and understand first. A spin-off. In a spin-off, the spin-off occurs when a subsidiary becomes an independent entity. The parent firm distributes the share of subsidiary to its shareholders through stock dividend. Since the transaction is dividend distribution, actually no cash is generated. So when you need capital, generally spin-off is not a good option, right? So what you're trying to do, achieve through spin-off is you would like to make your subsidiary an independent entity, right? So you give your shareholders the shares of new entity in form of stock dividend. Subsidiary becomes a separate legal entity with a distinct management and a board. Like carve-outs, spin-offs are usually about separating a healthy operation, right? So you generally do spin-off of the business vertical which is healthy. It is not generally done with the intention of an unhealthy business. So in most cases, you'd like to separate a healthy operation and make it a separate legal entity. In most cases, spin-offs unlock the hidden shareholder value. For the parent company, it sharpens the management focus. For a spin-off company, management does not have to compete for the parent's attention and capital. Once they are set free, managers can explore new opportunities. If you are a subsidiary of a company, for every decision, you will have to go and ask the parent. Now, when the spin-off happens, you become a separate legal entity. So now you will have to take your own decision. So sometimes what happens is you don't need parent support or focus. You can grow by yourself. So spin-off is advantageous when the managers of a subsidiary are more efficient. They can manage the business and they can create a value separately for an entity rather than a part of a company. Aditya Birla Group did this. So they did a spin-off of their financial series or services division. Financial services division. So Aditya Birla Group had a financial services division called Aditya Birla Financial Services. And what they did is, it was part of the group, but they felt that since this business has a huge potential if isolated and created as a special company, so they spin off this Aditya Birla Financial Services Limited and they become a separate legal entity. Spin-off or all contraction has the same logic, that an entity, if it is split out from the parent, it can operate more efficiently rather than being a part of family, right? Second is split off. So in a split off, a new company is created in order to take over the operations of an existing division or a unit of a company, right? So in a spin-off, you're just transferring the share of subsidiary to the existing shareholders, whereas in split off, an entirely new company is created in order to take over the operations of an existing division or a unit of a company. A portion of existing shareholders of a company obtain stocks in the subsidiary or a new company in exchange of the stock of a parent company. So as a result, the equity base of parent company is actually reduced, representing the downsizing or cut in the size of the capital. Thus, the shareholding of the new entity does not imply the shareholding of the parent company.